Thanks for coming to my talk. I'm going to talk about disempowerment fantasies and how to use taking power away from players to create better games, which may sound counterintuitive at first because games are sometimes called power fantasies, but this is where my original thesis came from. I wrote a thesis on this as my final bachelor's thesis. To dissect this assumption that games have to be power fantasies. But first, a little bit about myself. I'm Tamer. I have a bachelor's in game design, and I've worked on 3 different commercial games so far. I was an artist on Dead Age by Silent Dreams Entertainment, and for Daedalic Entertainment, I was a writer on The Night of the Rabbit, and a game designer, writer, assistant creative lead, narrative designer on Ken Follett's The Pillars of the Earth, which is an episodic adventure. Let's start with the definition of what I mean with disempowerment. What's important is that I mean disempowerment in a playful context and not disempowerment in an involuntary way. So disempowerment in this case is a voluntary restriction of the player's power in a temporarily limited and safe playful space for the sake of their own entertainment, amusement, and other psychological gains. This basically combines Johann Huizinga's definition of play with disempowerment. So it's playful disempowerment, and that's important. It's not the involuntary loss of power. Even if it is in a game context, if it's not voluntary, this doesn't apply. In video games, this phenomenon can occur in all game genres, but the most famous one is probably survival horror. Because just thinking about it intuitively, you can probably understand how a player could feel powerless in a survival horror game with overpowering enemies and limited weapons and scary environments. This sense of disempowerment is usually related to the perceived level of challenge in a game and the layers of game reality. And I'm gonna explain that one. But the layers of game reality and their communication channels between each other is actually directly linked to how games can create powerlessness in a player. First, the level of challenge. This is a graph from The Art of Game Design, a book of lenses by Jesse Schell. And this is based on the flow theory by Mihail Csikszentmihalyi. I know the name. I probably pronounced it entirely wrong, but flow theory, famous psychologist. This chart basically tells us that in order to reach a pleasant sensation of flow in game that is being entirely wrapped up in the moment, enjoying it, being there, forgetting everything around you, that's flow. In order to reach that, the level of challenge has to rise in this wavy motion, not necessarily that regular, but it has to rise, but it mustn't be a straight line, because by doing it this way, players have a sense of becoming better than the game, and then suddenly realizing that it's getting harder and harder and harder, but then they overcome this challenge and then they feel powerful again. It's this this mixture that creates flow. And powerlessness is somewhere in the anxiety category. Usually. Some rare examples can be in the boredom category as well, but it's usually related to how challenging the game is. So to explain what I meant by layers of game reality, this is also from The Art of Game Design by Jesse Schell, which explains that we have these different elements of a game that interact with each other. We have the player, we have the game world, and we have the virtual interface, and we have input and output. This is how they interact. The player doesn't directly interact with the game. They need a controller to do it. They need the visual and audio output in order to understand what's happening. They're not in direct contact. They have communication channels. And based on that, I created this this structure of different layers of game reality, which are made up of the player diegesis, which basically means world, but usually used in fictional contexts. The player diegesis, the core diegesis, and the avatar diegesis. And as you see, the avatar is inside of the core world, so the game world, in an objective, programmed way. And the player is outside of the game world and outside of the avatar, but the player can control the avatar with input. The avatar can deliver a subjective screen output, and the core game world can deliver objective screen output. And the avatar can interact with the world, and the world can interact with the avatar. But the player is, as I said, can only interact with the world through the avatar. And the black arrows are the communication channels, basically. And if this happens, if they're in some way distorted or changed, powerlessness can happen. For example, if the controller input doesn't match doesn't create the same reactions as it had before, it's chaos. If the screen output isn't in tune with what's actually happening in the game world, there's uncertainty. If the avatar can't control the game world anymore, there's a lack of agency and power to act. So these communication channels, if they are distorted, a sense of powerlessness can occur as well. But this is all very theoretical. So this is why I'm going to list different mechanisms in games that can create a sense of powerlessness as a design method. So how to design powerlessness in a player. And after that, I'm going to go into why you would want that. Because in general, you don't want the player to feel powerless. You want the player to feel like they can interact with the game effectively and that there's a challenge that they can handle. But to a certain degree, giving little bits of powerlessness can actually improve the overall experience. But why would we even care about this? Because video games can only be power fantasies, right? But this limits our understanding of the medium and our creative possibilities of how to use it, what stories we can tell, and what gameplay we can design. I'm gonna. I hope that they're gonna be understandable, pretty with not a lot of explanation, because they're. You probably know what I mean. So the first mechanism of the list is audio-visual disempowerment mechanisms. For example, audio-visual distortions. Like in Amnesia, The Dark Descent, you can see things that aren't really there. The screen gets blurry. It plays with light. On the right hand, Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, there are the so-called sanity effects, which create hallucinations, so to say, in-game hallucinations that go as far as becoming meta hallucinations, like this one, where the game suddenly acts on its own and pretends to delete the save file. And the player can't do anything against it, but then the game basically goes, haha, just kidding, nothing happened. So yeah, the player completely lost control at that moment. There's also audiovisual restrictions, for example, fog in horror games, or for example in Fatal Frame, where you can only see the ghosts looking through the camera, and otherwise you have no way of seeing them. In the core diegetic, the core game world, you can encounter spatial distortions, in a sense that the world changes its meaning. This game is called Eversion, which is basically a cube platformer, but there are eversion points, and when you walk into them, let's say the parallel universe changes. So like you go into another layer of reality, and it goes from really cute, like on the left, to horrible nightmare visions on the right. And the layout is still the same, but the meaning of the different blocks and characters are changed depending on which layer of reality you're in. Then there is spatial restrictions, which can be something like there are guards that you have to avoid, which is kind of like a moving spatial restriction because their field of vision is what restricts your path. Or stuff like in Soma, where you have to use the Omni tool to open doors, but you have to upload the right stuff onto it first before you can open the door. Then there's world meaning distortions, which is also a little bit like that Eversion game. An interesting example is Default Dan on the left, which basically functions like any other Super Mario side-scrolling platformer. But every element that you know from other platformers, like coins or spikes, actually have the opposite meaning of what you're used to. So coins kill you and spikes give you a boost. Something similar happens in Undertale several times. This example is where you have to defend yourself from arrows coming from all sides by just moving your shield into that direction. But after a while, other kinds of arrows occur that don't point towards you but away from you, and they will jump to the opposite side at the very last second. So basically, you've learned, oh, an arrow comes from the top. I have to direct my shield to the top, but since it's turned away from you, it's going to come from the bottom. Then another usually comedic mechanism is the distortion of controls, which can mean that you take controls as the game genre usually uses them and just switch them around, or you take the already existing controls in your game and change them at a certain point in time. This can also mean that you take very simple things in real life, which happen automatically, like grabbing something, and make it very complicated and complex, like in Surgeon Simulator, where you have to control every single finger and can't just grab something by pressing a button. The example on the right is a mini game from Mario Party 2, where the characters stand in the middle of the record at first, and then it spins very fast, and then everyone is dizzy, and the controls are the opposite of what they used to be. Up is down, left is right, and you just have to walk to the middle, and that's the entire minigame. Then another sense of disempowerment can come from not getting any instructions in any game in general, like no tutorial, just throwing you in there and you have to fend for yourself. And there's also restriction of controls, like for example in the Five Nights at Freddy's series, where you can't really do much. You can control doors and light and look at the cameras, but you can't move from your desk, which you might want to do if the place you're working at is basically haunted by demonic animatronics, but you can't. You can just sit there, and the restriction of controls adds to the horror and feeling of powerlessness. You can also restrict resources known from every survival game, and also often survival horror, but it can also happen in first-person shooters where you have limited ammo. Then there's also physical needs, which is kind of like a restriction of resources, but you have a need for more resources over time. So you don't only have to be frugal with what you have, you actually have to get more with time. Then there's also the classic power imbalance, where the enemy is way, way stronger than the avatar, or the mechanism of suspended death, which is basically every arcade game ever, where you can't really win, you can only postpone your death. And this is a kind of powerlessness as well, like you win, you can reach a high score, but you can't reach an end. Then another way to make the player feel powerless is defense mechanisms in the sense of escort missions. There is something else that you have no direct control over via input, but you have to defend it as well. And this element of lack of control creates the sense of powerlessness. Like, for example, in Ico or in Glover, where you have to defend your rubber ball. Then on the layer of narration, there is incomplete or wrong information, where your decisions are based on something that isn't according to the truth of the game. This example here is this indie game called Mondo Medicals, where you get clear instructions what to do. It's usually just puzzles and mazes. Like follow the arrows to get to the exit. But you always have to disobey the instructions to progress further, and just following instructions doesn't lead you anywhere. And there's also the narrative disempowerment, as in you see something or read something and you can't do anything about it. It can be a cutscene, it can be a document, it can be something happening outside of your area of control, but this is a narrative disempowerment that occurs in lots of games, sometimes not on purpose. Like when in a cutscene something happens which you wouldn't have done if you could control your avatar. It's often it's not intentionally disempowering, but accidental. Then there's also forced decisions, like in BioShock, where you only at the end find out, oh, I've been brain controlled this whole time. Spoilers. It's 11 years old, guys. Then there's the moral dilemmas, like in Papers, Please, where you basically have to decide, am I gonna earn enough money to get treatment for my sick son, but then basically separate this man from his family, or am I gonna let him go through and risk losing my job entirely? Yeah. So this was an overview of the mechanisms that can create powerlessness in a player if you choose to design that. Usually they're not meant to be the core experience. Like this can happen, like in Papers, Please. It's basically the core experience. But many games use them like spices every now and then. And looking at the reasons why players would ever enjoy feelings of disempowerment in their games, the reasons will give an insight into when you might want to do this. There are the sources at the bottom in white on light gray. You will understand without the sources, but you can ask me later if you want sources on what these theories are based on. The first one is and this is my result of my bachelor's thesis. I was basically, okay, I'm gonna make up a bunch of theories now why this could be desirable. The first one is the rich game experience theory, that players actually feel like they're playing a better made game, which is more challenging, has more depth, and a more complex experience. Something that enables them to get into a flow while playing, that they're not bored or anxious, but something that enriches them. The second theory is the thrill theory. Plain and simple, players enjoy adrenaline. This can be compared to like going on a roller coaster or seeing a horror movie, that they just enjoy the rush and or the following relaxation, because some players don't actually like the stress, but they like when the stress is over. And they feel better after the stress is over than if they hadn't experienced the stress at all. It's kind of like how when you're exercising and afterwards you're like, oh, I feel so much better now, but during it you didn't feel so good. The third one is the underdog theory, that when the challenge is bigger in the beginning, winning is actually way more meaningful. That happens in a bunch of games that just throw you into the final boss fight right in the beginning, and you're not supposed to win. You're just supposed to see, oh damn, that's a hard boss. I can't win at all, and then you have the entire game to practice and train and level up, and then you can beat the boss, and you're like, yay, I've gotten so much stronger now. And the final victory is more meaningful that way. The next one is regression theory, which is just enjoying temporarily giving up all responsibility and control. That depends on what type of game you're playing, but this can be de-stressing as well. There's reframing theory, which is basically if you exclude all the obvious solutions, problem solving will become more creative, and this can, on the one hand, work as a challenge for the mind, but also in order to get the player into new perspectives, also from a narrative standpoint. Then there's parody of vulnerability theory, which is basically taking a vulnerable situation and making it so over the top and comedic that you can deal with the subject matter without feeling attacked. It's like a dark comedy, horrible subject matter, but it's so funny that you enjoy dealing with it, and it makes it possible to deal with it in a pleasurable way. There's also the optimal learning theory, which is basically based on the findings that humans are more likely to look for why they failed rather why they succeeded. So if you have a player fail certain times or have a thing more challenging, they're more likely to learn faster and more in the long term. And there's the safe practice theory, which basically says you can practice challenging situations and frustrations in a safe environment that way. Yeah, and there's a structured experience theory, which is kind of like the art theory, that people simply enjoy having artfully structured experiences as opposed to chaotic life. Like, so much things happen in life and things don't necessarily make sense, but if you can structure it in a thematic way, in like one story, one game, one piece of art, it's just satisfying because you can share it, and it's kind of like the affirmation that what you can relate to is a valid emotion, so to say. And yeah, feelings of powerlessness are a part of human experience. So the conclusion is, yeah, we should consider putting disempowering mechanisms into our games, not all games, but even power fantasies like shooters, action adventures can benefit and usually already use disempowering mechanisms because it can lead to innovation in gameplay, enhance the immersion and game experience, creates better learning environments, and enables us to tell more diverse stories. Yeah, and now's the time for questions.
So yeah, we will go around and give you the mic if you want to ask a question. Would be great if you can do it in English to keep it consistent. If not, that's fine too. So, but if you're able, that would be great. Any questions?
Thank you for the talk. I have a question on your definition of voluntary versus involuntary. Mm-hmm. I do have a choice of playing the games, of course, but I feel like the games you mentioned, most of them don't give me a choice whether or not I want this power loss. Say, in the shooter, I want 10 shotgun shells, but I only get 1. So, could you define that a little bit? Like,
yeah, the voluntary part comes from choosing to play the game. You still have the choice to just stop playing, and that's the whole voluntary part. No game is going to force you to continue. If you feel forced, that means that the game does something right in another way, I suppose. But yeah, the voluntary part comes from, it's a game, you choose to play it, you can just switch off your console or your PC whenever you want.
Another question?
First of all, thanks for the talk. And since you work at Delic, how does this work? Okay, sorry. How does this at all apply to point-and-click adventures?
Point-and-click adventures work on information management. Puzzles are often based on what information you have at what point, and you have to collect information and tools. And this is a big part of feeling powerless, not having the entire information. And yeah, but some point-and-click adventures don't only go the route of what information you get, but also use it narratively, like things that you can influence and things you can't influence, things that will happen either way. And some games also have mini games. So for example, the one that I worked on, the Pillars of the Earth, we had quick time events and mini games, and we used those as well in order to create a sense of powerlessness and urgency. Like, for example, there's a scene where one of the main characters walks in a sandstorm, and instead of the regular walking where you just click on the ground and she walks, you actually have to complete quick time events for every other step, because the sandstorm is so intense that you can't walk normally, but it's getting more complicated from a gameplay point of view. So you can basically use this in all game genres.
Okay, I see. Thanks.
Another question?
So, it's just a follow-up that you mentioned that you can create more diverse narrations with this mechanic. Do you mean that these mechanics, that the idea of disempowerment can influence the plot or the player's experience?
Well, it can influence. It should define the player's experience. But I mean, what I meant was the stories should also be told through the gameplay. So if you tell a story that isn't a power fantasy, where you place somebody in a disadvantaged position, these mechanisms should come into place to create an experience that that is true to what the narration is going on about.
Okay, so to mimic the narration, basically.
Yeah, basically, if you still create a power fantasy game which has these disempowering mechanisms in it, it's not diversifying storytelling. But using these mechanisms, you can tell more diverse stories by telling them about people who are not the powerful.
Other questions?
So I got one on my own. The things you mentioned, what could be disempowerments, the examples you gave, all these were, I would say, some kind of obstacles that the player has to overcome. And in that sense, I wonder, isn't any game about disempowerment? Because I don't know, in Super Mario you cannot run into spikes. That's an obstacle that restricts the player and restricts his power. So I mean the absolute power fantasy would be in God mode, where you cannot die, where you can move through every object or whatever, can do whatever you want. So in a sense, every game is based on restriction and disempowering in a certain way. So my question is, where do you draw for yourself or in your definition the line? This is a game that uses disempowerment actively, and this is a game that only uses disempowerments because that's the game mechanic. So.
Well, I would say that all games are also designed power management. So creating the absolute power fantasy where there's no obstacles, you have no downfalls, actually won't feel powerful. Every game already has disempowerment mechanisms. It was more about creating a tool set and an awareness of what you can use and for what you can use it. I would differentiate between designed disempowerment and accidental disempowerment by its effectiveness, actually. If you have disempowerment in a situation that frustrates the player without giving them anything psychologically, like for example the cutscene example, where you expected to have power over a certain decision and then it just happens in a cutscene, and that is not if it doesn't say anything, like if it's not part of the statement that the game is trying to make, and it just happens to be in there and it has no purpose, then it's accidental disempowerment, and that's something that should be avoided. Anything that has a positive effects, even if it's not actively used by the game designer, then it's like a lucky accident, I would say.
Any other question?
I'll take another one if I may. Have you looked at all into how different personality types of players like or dislike different mechanics? Like, for example, I really liked Resident Evil and like having to manage my ammo and whatnot. And I really wanted to like Amnesia, but I hated it. So clearly some people love it though, so.
Yeah, different players have different frustration tolerances. And I think not only in general, but also in regards to where the frustration comes from. I haven't gone into depth because that's like a whole other subject matter. again, but there are different levels of frustration, desired frustration levels, and this will influence what kind of games players want to play. Like those with an extremely low frustration tolerance will play like idle clickers or something, or really easy games, and others play Dark Souls. And in The Art of Failure, there's a chapter on that, which is basically players have different frustration, different desires regarding their frustration.
Any questions at all? Any other questions? Well, if not, then thank you, for your exciting talk.